Eric Hanushek has led in introducing scientific research and evidence into decision-making on elementary and secondary education in the United States and around the globe.
I got into education research almost accidentally. When I was in my graduate studies at MIT, I was looking around for a thesis topic when the Coleman Report, the first major study of student achievement, was issued. Everybody interpreted that report as saying schools really didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was families. And I thought that had to have been a crazy answer. So I got into writing a thesis on education, even though no economists at the time were doing that. When I looked at achievement in the US using the Coleman data, I found that Coleman was partly right. The things that we measured about schools, such as class size or teacher experience, or even expenditures on schools, were not very closely correlated with student achievement. But the Coleman Report was entirely wrong about the role of schools, because schools were seen to be really important once you took into account the effectiveness of teachers. And this work also led me to another conclusion, and that was that many policy decisions were being made with absolutely no or very limited evidence. One of the things that the early research pointed out was that you had to follow the learning of individual students in order to understand what was happening to them. This led me fairly quickly to a collaboration with John Kane, who was at the University of Texas at Dallas, and we started the Texas Schools Project, which used the common individual data that schools produced in order to follow their achievement. This approach has now been used quite broadly as schools regularly report individual achievement, largely through the accountability systems of schools.
The Texas data have driven some of the most influential analyses of the effects of teachers and schools on student knowledge and skills, overturning many widely held beliefs about schools. Importantly, the results of this work have directly entered into laws, regulations, and judicial decisions on school policy in many parts of the United States. Rather than just keeping the data for their own research, John Kane and Rick saw the advantages of sharing access, and their model for research on state administrative data spread broadly across the United States and ultimately across countries. Congratulations, Rick, on receiving this wonderful and richly deserved award.
As fate would have it, the Texas governor at the time, George W. Bush, won his bid to be the 43rd President of the United States. He brought to his administration many of the successful policies from his time as governor, including the idea of holding schools accountable for student performance. Student-level data with regular performance measures was the foundation of No Child Left Behind, the federal accountability law.
Well, once states started to develop their own longitudinal data systems, which enabled them to track what happened to students over time, it became possible to do studies all over the country about what was effective in improving student outcomes. Hanushek was actually the leader in much of that work, looking at teacher effectiveness, about school accountability systems, and about financing structures and incentives. Eventually, scholars all over the country decided to jump on and use the data to conduct their own work. And some scholars conducted the same study in parallel, using data from their own states or pooled data from a variety of states. This dramatically expanded the amount of information we had about what helped and what did not help advance student learning. As a result, the body of empirical work expanded dramatically in the first decade of this century.
The tools to measure and assess student learning evolved, not only in the United States but across the globe. The critical role that teachers play in providing high-quality education became broadly recognized.
Rick's research has had really extraordinary influence on development banks such as the World Bank, where I worked for several decades, and more importantly, on developing country ministers of education and finance. I think this is because his research is centered on the big issues that they grapple with, such as how do you measure teacher quality, how important is it to spend on teachers compared to other schooling inputs, and above all, how much does education contribute to economic growth? Second, he always finds ways to communicate research results in ways that resonate with policymakers. Instead of talking about test score changes in terms of standard deviations, he shows that students with the best teachers in a school will master almost a year more of the curriculum than students with the worst teachers, even in the same grade over the course of a single school year. Similarly, by showing that a year of schooling in some countries produces much more learning than others, and that this helps explain differences in long-term economic growth, Rick's work has really contributed to the big shift in focus and development goals towards student learning and education quality rather than years of schooling and quantity.
Rick is one of the most generous persons I know in sharing his knowledge and his wisdom. He's a prime example of solid scholarship and international collaboration, building insights on policies and programs. One of Rick's great achievements as a teacher and as a mentor has been the creation of the CSIFO research network on the economics of education. This network supports scholars from all around the world in rigorous analysis of education policies, labor markets, and human capital development. The results of Rick's research have motivated the Jacobs Foundation's push on education in Africa. We have invested more than $50 million in our TREC program in Côte d'Ivoire, where we want to transform education in cocoa communities and fight child labor through quality education. TREC builds on Rick's foundational research, and we are more than grateful to him for that.
Other countries have pursued programs to build systematic information about student knowledge. Internationally, the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, that examines what 15-year-olds know in reading, science, and mathematics, brought consistent measurement across the 93 countries that have joined this OECD effort.
PISA and other international tests set up the opportunity to conduct global analysis to examine the impact that primary and secondary education has in the productivity of countries. The work that Rick and I have produced clearly breaks the myth that years of schooling, regardless of quality, matters in building national economies. Knowledge and skills drive future prosperity, not simply the time spent in classrooms. That's actually why we like to refer to the aggregate performance of students as the knowledge capital that nations have. Moreover, the growing international data permit rigorous investigation of why students in some countries perform so much better than those in other countries. International analyses can in particular advance our understanding how institutional features such as regular testing or local decision-making affect learning outcomes.
There is nothing more important than a high-quality education for every child. And the work that Rick Hanushek has done to help us to understand what constitutes a quality education, to understand the factors that will bring quality education to every child. He has worked comparatively across countries to understand some of the best educational practices, and I think as such he has improved education not just in the United States but globally. Rick Hanushek is someone who has done so much great original data-based, very systematic work on the status of education, on how to evaluate educational outcomes, and then how to think about policy implications of those outcomes. As an economist, he really has almost created a whole field about this kind of assessment, and so he's very deserving of the Yidan Prize because of the originality and creativity of his work and his work in this extremely important area.
Advances in robust data on student learning, coupled with an emerging cadre of researchers schooled in rigorous empirical analysis, have created an expanding trove of evidence about which policies and programs work and which do not. In addition, the now clear understanding of the future economic impact of student skills provides strong motivation for decision makers around the world.
Education leaders can now draw upon increasingly conclusive evidence about how best to educate their students and to improve their schools.